A truck crawls through 11 kilometers of screaming crowds. On it, the coffin of a man who ruled the Islamic Republic of Iran for 36 years. Millions of people, water cannons cooling the heat, effigies of an American president burning in the street. This is not the funeral the world expected. Everyone is watching the coffin. That's the mistake. The real story isn't in Tehran's streets. It's in the empty seat that should have been filled, and wasn't. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not appeared in public since the war began. Not at his father's deathbed, not at the mosque, not once in a funeral procession watched by an estimated 12 to 15 million people. A man who inherited command of Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile arsenal, and the loyalty of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and he is nowhere to be seen. Mainstream coverage is treating this as a story about grief. It is not. It is a story about control. Who has it, who's pretending to have it, and what happens in the vacuum when the man at the top can't prove he's actually in charge. That's what we're going to take apart today, not the coffin, the gap behind it. To understand what's happening in Tehran right now, you have to stop thinking about it as a funeral and start thinking about it as a legitimacy operation. Every authoritarian system that survives a decapitation strike faces the same structural problem. The outside world, and more dangerously its own population, needs immediate proof that the machine still runs. Not that the leader survived, that the system survived him. This is not new. It's a pattern as old as centralized power itself. When Stalin died in 1953, the Kremlin staged one of the largest funerals in human history. Not for Stalin, but for the Soviet state, to signal continuity to a population that had never known another leader. When Khamenei died in 1989, Iran's 1989 funeral became the reference point every Iranian analyst has been citing this week, because Al Jazeera and others have already flagged that this new funeral is expected to surpass it in scale. Scale is the message. A government doesn't organize a 6-day multi-city procession, Tehran to Qom, then through Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, ending in burial at Mashhad, because that's what religious tradition strictly requires. It does it because a fragmented, war-battered state needs the optics of unity more than it needs efficiency. Here's the mechanic. Most coverage is skipping. Iran's government has announced a 40-day mourning period and a full week of public holidays. That's not sentiment. That is a deliberate freeze on the ordinary rhythms of civil life. Work, protest, dissent, replaced by a single state-controlled emotional narrative. Grief and vengeance. Grief absorbs attention. Vengeance redirects it outward, toward Washington and Tel Aviv, away from the uncomfortable question of who's actually issuing orders in Tehran this week. This is the first structural law you need to understand. Regimes that survive decapitation don't mourn to heal. They mourn to reassert command of the narrative before someone else writes it for them. And the fact that Iran needed to reach for the maximum possible spectacle, millions of mourners, cross-border processions through Iraq, water cannons keeping crowds from collapsing in the heat, tells you the leadership judged its legitimacy deficit to be severe. You don't deploy the biggest funeral in modern Iranian history for a government that feels secure. The official narrative says Khamenei is dead, his son Mojtaba has been named supreme leader, and Iran's chain of command is intact. The reality is messier, and it's sitting in plain sight if you read past the headlines. Mojtaba Khamenei was reportedly injured in the same February 28th strike that killed his father. Burns to his face and body, and wounds serious enough to require multiple operations on one leg. One senior Iranian official has publicly downplayed this, calling the injuries not very serious. But he has not appeared publicly, not on state television, not in an audio statement, not at his own father's funeral, an absence so conspicuous that international outlets have flagged it directly. And Iranian officials and a Middle Eastern diplomat both told reporters he wasn't expected to attend. Sit with that for a second. In a system built entirely around the visible, unbroken authority of one man at the top, the Rahbar, the guide, whose legitimacy is theological as much as political, the successor cannot be seen for over 4 months. There are only 2 explanations, and neither one is good for Tehran. Option 1, the injuries are genuinely severe and the regime is buying time to either stabilize him for a controlled public reappearance or to quietly manage a transition to someone else without admitting weakness in the middle of a war. Option 2, the injuries are secondary to a deeper problem, a contest inside the clerical and military establishment over whether Mojtaba, a hardliner with limited independent standing in the assembly of experts, is actually the man they want, holding both religious and military authority during an active confrontation with the United States and Israel. Notice who did show up. Iran's judiciary chief was reappointed to a powerful post during the funeral itself, a move made in the middle of a mourning period, timed for maximum continuity signaling. Iran's hardline former president, a man estranged from Khamenei for years, made a rare public appearance. President Pezeshkian walked in the procession. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf was visible, publicly acknowledging that implementing the ceasefire what's being referred to as the Islamabad Memorandum, is, in his words, difficult but achievable. Every major power center in Iran sent its face to Tehran streets, except the one person who's supposed to now hold all the power. This is the pattern intelligence analysts look for when assessing regime stability after a decapitation event. Not who claims the title, but who's willing to be photographed next to the person holding it. Right now, nobody's being photographed next to Mojtaba Khamenei, because Mojtaba Khamenei isn't in any photographs. Now overlay the military picture, because the succession crisis isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening inside an active, fragile ceasefire. The war that killed Khamenei began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched strikes that decapitated Iran's top leadership. Since then, there has been a negotiated framework, the Islamabad Memorandum, that Iran's own negotiators are publicly describing as barely holding together. Ghalibaf didn't say the ceasefire is stable. He said it's difficult but achievable. That is not the language of a government confident in its own restraint or in Washington's. Here's the strategic bind Tehran is in, and it's worth being cold and precise about it. A wounded regime, mid-succession crisis, cannot afford to look weak in front of its own population, which is exactly why the funeral has been engineered around chants of death to America, stone throwing at images of the US president, and burned American and Israeli flags. This is compensatory signaling. It's projecting strength outward specifically because the internal picture is fragile. But a wounded regime also cannot afford renewed war, not with its supreme leader's own son unable or unwilling to publicly assume command. Not with the IRGC needing to know whose orders they're actually executing if this ceasefire breaks down at Hormuz or anywhere else. This is the fatal error risk on Iran's side, using maximalist rhetoric to paper over minimalist actual capacity. When Ali Abdullahi, commander of Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, publicly warned the U.S. not to strike during the funeral processions, the warning was as much about deterring an opportunistic move from Washington as it was about projecting Iranian strength. A government secure in its command structure doesn't need to warn adversaries away from a funeral. It assumes the funeral is untouchable by default. On the American side, the fatal error risk runs in the opposite direction, mistaking visible chaos for exploitable weakness. A U.S. or Israeli move during this window, reading Mojtaba's absence and the succession ambiguity as an invitation to press further, would almost certainly do the one thing that could actually stabilize Iran's fractured leadership. Hand it an external enemy to unify against. At the exact moment, internal unity is what's missing. Nothing consolidates a wounded regime faster than an attack during its own mourning period. Every actor in this theater knows that. It's why Abdullahi's warning matters. It's not just posturing, it's a genuine flashpoint risk being flagged in real time. This is the move-counter-move that actually determines what happens next, and it has almost nothing to do with the coffin. If Iran's leadership manages a controlled, verifiable reappearance of Mojtaba Khamenei in the coming weeks, public, on state television, exercising visible command, that's the strongest signal the succession is real, and the ceasefire has an actual counterparty on the Iranian side. If the silence continues past the 40-day mourning period, that silence becomes the story, regardless of what state media says. Prolonged invisibility of a nominal supreme leader is, in intelligence terms, itself a data point. One that regional actors from Saudi Arabia to the Gulf states to Israel will be reading closely when calculating whether Iran's chain of command can actually authorize or restrain retaliation. If Washington or Israel treat the funeral period, or the weeks immediately after it, as a window of opportunity rather than a period to observe, the ceasefire's difficult but achievable status collapses into achieved nothing. This is where the story stops being about one government and starts being about the wider architecture it sits inside. Iran's leadership crisis doesn't stay inside Iran's borders, because Iran's regional posture was never just about Iran. It's built on a network of aligned or allied actors. From Iraq, where Muqtada al-Sadr has personally invited pilgrims to participate in the funeral ceremonies, to positions across the wider Shia political landscape that watch Tehran's internal stability as a proxy for their own security. When a 6-day funeral procession routes deliberately through Najaf and Karbala, some of the most religiously significant cities in Shia Islam, located in a different sovereign country, that is not a logistics decision. It's a projection of continued regional reach, timed for a moment when that reach is genuinely in question. Iran is using its dead supreme leader's body to physically demonstrate that its influence still crosses the Iraqi border unimpeded, at the exact moment its domestic succession is unresolved. That's the layer most Western coverage is missing entirely. The funeral route is the foreign policy statement, and this is precisely why the framing of what comes next could shake the region isn't hyperbole, it's structural. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves, sits under the shadow of whatever Iran's military and political leadership decides it can or cannot risk in the coming months. Gulf states are recalibrating their own postures in real time based on a single unresolved variable. Does Iran currently have a leader who can both authorize and restrain its forces? Markets are watching for exactly that signal, whether or not the average trader consciously frames it that way. Energy security calculations across the Gulf are not built on whether Khamenei is dead. Everyone has already priced that in. They're built on whether whoever comes next can actually issue and enforce orders. Right now, the honest answer from the available evidence is unconfirmed. Strip away the crowds, the chants, the burning effigies, all real, all documented, all genuinely reflecting the anger of millions of Iranians who lost a leader they revered. That grief is not manufactured, but grief and governance are two different things, and only one of them is actually in question right now. The coffin proves Khamenei is dead. Everyone already knew that. What the coffin can't prove, no matter how many millions walk behind it, no matter how many cities it passes through, no matter how large Iranian state media makes the crowd estimates, is that someone is now unambiguously in command. That proof requires a different kind of evidence.